Welcome to day one of our short circular sock tutorial. I'm using an Addy sock wonder where one needle is longer than the other. They're 25 centimeters in total, but you do get them sometimes where both needles are the same size. Can be a little bit more fiddly, and the longer needle is designed to fit in your hand a little bit easier, but it's really a matter of preference. To get started, we're going to do a slip knot and a long tail cast on. So we're going to start with a slip knot and a long tail. So the first thing is to estimate the tail that you're going to need for a long tail cast on. And we talk about this in the DPN tutorial as well. So what I do when I'm estimating is I use a hand wrap around my own hand once per 10 stitches, and I use that for both double knitting and 4-ply weight yarn. It can come out a little bit long, but you don't want to run out of yarn when you're doing a long tail cast on. So that is the amount of yarn that I use, and then I tie my slip knot. So to tie a slip knot, what I do is I dangle it over my left hand, and on one side I have my working yarn, which is that attached to the ball, and I have my tail yarn down the other side. Once you have your yarn in the correct position over your fingers, you take your working yarn attached to your ball and you take it underneath your finger, your index finger, and then you bring it across the tail yarn. You lift the tail yarn from underneath and then you poke through the working yarn. Easier to watch than to describe. So we'll do that again. So you hang it down uncrossed, and then you take your working yarn and you take it underneath your index finger over your tail yarn, and then gently lift the tail yarn and pull through your working yarn, and that gives you your slip knot, and then you'll be ready to put that onto your needle. So then you take your slip knot and you put it onto your needle, and then you tighten it out a little bit. And once you've got your slip knot on your needle, it is your first stitch, and you always count it as one. Once your slip knot is ready, you're ready to do your long tail cast on. So you have your tail and your working yarn. Your working yarn is that attached to the ball. So put your two fingers together, your thumb and your index finger, and put them between your tail yarn and your working yarn. Then using the three fingers underneath, grasp the yarns below. Pull them wide, your thumb and your index finger wide, and with your needle in the center, you are then ready to cast on your stitches using the long tail cast on method. So your first stitch is on your needle, your slip stitch, and you are now ready to start casting on. So what you're going to do is you hold the needle between your thumb and your index finger with the slip knot on it. You take your needle to the left towards your thumb and down below the further thread of the working yarn on the left hand side. So you go right down over both threads and up through the center of the threads of the yarn where the loop around your thumb. So as you come up from the loop, you then go over to the right and down between the two strands of the loop that's around your index finger. Then bring it round, because it's on the tip of the needle. Bring it through the loop again on the thumb. Let the loop go, and then use your thumb to pull the working yarn to create your stitch. Now it's going to take a little while. We're going to do this a few times. Don't worry. That's created your stitch. So you are going to go again. So you go down again to the left, over the full loop on your thumb, up through the center of the loop. Then you take your needle and you go over to the right and above and down through the loop that's around your index finger. You put that onto the tip of your needle and you come through the loop on your thumb the other way, slip the loop off your thumb and use your thumb to tighten it up by pulling the tail yarn. Again, this is a move you get used to as you do it more and more. So let's do that again. Down to the left, up through the loops on the thumb, around, above, in through the needles on your index, through, slip the loop off your thumb, and then pull it tight using the tail yarn. We'll do that one more time. We'll keep doing it a few more times. So down to the left, up through the center, over to the right, grasp the yarn, take it through the loop around the thumb, off the thumb, and use the tail yarn to tighten that up. So down to the left, over to the right, grasp the yarn through the loop and slip it off. And then you are ready to cast on the number of stitches for the size that you're making. I'm casting on 44 as I'm making the smallest size. A little tip that I want to give you as we're doing this cast on is how to make sure your stitches are loose enough, because it can be quite tempting to make them quite tight. So As you can see, I'm holding the short circular needle and I'm going to make my stitch. Watch what happens if I pull it too tight. It gets too close to the needle and it gets too close to the previous stitch. Whereas if I make another stitch, what I'm trying to do here is I'm showing you that it's in the space of yarn between the stitches rather than in the stitch itself as it goes around the needle. So you can see how you can get yourself a little bit of extra stretch in your cast on as you do this rather than having the stitches too tight. And that is very useful in a sock because your rib of your cuff will pull it in, but you will not have that kind of rigidity that you might have with a tighter cast on. So once you have all of your stitches cast on, you are ready to join in the round. But I'm going to show you what I do when I am doing this. I add one extra stitch to my cast on. So I have 44 stitches cast on because I am doing the smallest size of the DK sock pattern, but I then cast on an extra stitch. So before you join in the round, it's really important to make sure that on your circular needles, your short circulars and long, that you haven't twisted your yarn. So do this by making sure your stitches are the correct way around on the needle. So you can do this by looking at the edges. On one side, and this will show you what it looks like when it's twisted. So it's quite obvious on a short needle. It's a little bit more tricky to tell if you have a longer needle. So make sure that your stitches are untwisted. And then you can also tell because there were bumps on one side and there's a smoother edge on one side because you have cast on and the bumps are on the. So once you've made sure that your stitches aren't twisted, you want to position your yarns ready to work so that they aren't through the center of the work after you've joined it. So take your working yarn and make sure that it's ready to work and it's on the right hand side of your work and it isn't through the center of the needles. So for example, I'll just show you that. Make sure that it's not where so your tail is fine because you can move that in and out, but make sure that your working yarn is in a position where it won't be through the center once you've joined in the round. Then I take my extra stitch, my last stitch cast on, and put it beside the first stitch cast on so that I can join in the round by knitting those two stitches together. Once I've moved the stitch across, I then get myself a stitch marker so that I have positioned myself for where I'm at the start of the round. And this is something that's really key when you're using the small circular needles because it isn't as obvious as the DP ends as to where the start of the round is. So you're now going to knit the first two stitches together. If the pattern called for them to be purled together, a purl stitch at the first one, you would purl them together. So I just knit my first stitch and then I've joined and I'm ready to work in the round. So I then knit the second stitch because this pattern calls for a 2x2 rib and then I just start working in the round. You don't have to use the extra stitch, and in the PDF that goes with this lesson you'll see the different ways of avoiding any gaps in your round. So I'm knitting my rib, and we talk about knitting rib in the round as opposed to working it back and forth as you would. Oh, just check my little gap, give it a little tiny pull, and you can see that you can fix those as you go. You can also use the seam, the tail yarn to hide those later on. So when knitting rib in the round, you need to remember that it's different to knitting rib flat. Not the first row, but the subsequent rows. Well, subsequent rounds, because you're in the round. If I'm knitting back and forth, I knit two stitches, might be knit, two purl, two knit, two purl, and on the way back, my stitches will be two knit, two purl, two knit, two purl. You do the reverse type of stitch as you go. That is not the case when you're working in the round. All rounds are the same when you're doing a rib, so it'll be two knit, two purl, and then on top of those stitches as you go around you will do two more knit and two more purl. And that is just the way it is. It's the same with stocking stitch in the round, which we'll talk about when we get to the leg. So there's nothing particularly unusual. We're just going to complete the round on the sock wonder now, knitting two and purling two as per the pattern. One thing I would say is that if you are using a sock wonder and the needle is longer on one side, do make sure it's in your working hand. So if you're right-handed, your right hand. If you're left-handed and you're going the other way, use it in your left hand because it's been designed for that comfort. I'm just going to speed this up a little as we get towards the, just to finish the round. There really isn't anything different. Two knit, two purl all the way around. So I'm just finishing the round now, and as I come to the end, I will flick my marker across and knit the first two stitches of my round. And that's it, really. You're joined in the round, you pull it tightly, and you're off. And there's nothing funny, you don't do anything as you come to the marker except slip it. Now, just to show you again what I'm talking about when I talk about knitting rib in the round, you'll see that I am knitting two, purling two, and knitting two. And that is just how you knit rib in the round, as opposed to back and forth. And I'll show you now, if I reverse that, I would be purling, knitting, and purling, rather than knitting, purling and knitting. So now I'm ready to finish the number of rounds required for my rib, and I will be back after that. So I am just coming up to finishing the last round of my rib. I've done 8 rounds. You should definitely do as many as the pattern says. So I'm just before the marker here at the start of the round. So there's a couple of things when you're doing the leg. Once you come to the leg, there are different things that might happen in the first row after you finished your cuff. So you might be adding additional stitches. You may be taking them away because the number of stitches in your rib might not be how many you need for your leg. You may also be changing needle sizes. So for example, if you were going to be doing colour work, and you might also be placing markers at different points in the round if you were going to be doing a pattern. Now this pattern doesn't require that, but those are things to look out for when you are knitting from other patterns. The pattern for this tutorial, however, is super easy, and it is just stocking stitching around. So you finish your last row of rib, slip your marker, and you are ready to do a stocking stitch all the way down the leg of your sock. So garter stitch, stocking stitch, sorry, in the round is knit all stitches in all rounds, and that gives you the stocking stitch effect. That's different to stocking stitch flat, where you would knit a row, purl a row, knit a row, purl a row, and that's just the only difference really when you're knitting stocking stitch in the round and versus flat. The next thing then is, how long do you knit your sock leg? You knit that as long as you would like, or you knit it as far as the pattern wants you to. It's 6 inches if you're knitting the DK pattern and 8 if you are knitting the 4-ply pattern for this challenge. However, you could do it as long or as short as you want, just bearing in mind that the longer you make it, the more yarn you may need. So as you come to the end of your first round of stocking stitch, you just move your marker and keep doing stocking stitch. And you do that for the full length of the leg. So I'm going to go away now and I'm going to finish my leg, and I will be back to you tomorrow for day 2 when we're going to do our heel flap. Thank you for listening.